Hey folks, it's Pat here with a Let's Play of Carriers of War. Now you might be asking, why are we playing a 25-year-old game? And that's a fair question. But I figured, this is probably the best naval war game I've ever played. And we're coming up on the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor and the war here. And I figured it would be a good time to revisit this thing and actually, walk you through it and, share a couple memories and at the same point in time talk a little bit about the Pacific War. And no game out there really kind of captures it as well as this one does because this game is all about carrier combat. Now, as far as the game goes, it's not a tactical level game and it's not a strategic level game. So you're not going to pilot individual ships and planes, and you're certainly not going to divvy up resources and decide what ships to build. Now, it kind of forces you into the operational role of an admiral in World War II. And I like walking in other people's shoes when it comes to war games, and this one does a really good job of actually forcing you to make decisions and really puts you into the seat of a commander of a carrier task force during World War II with all the ups and downs and almost exactly the same decisions. So it's a really good game as far as that goes. It's not a pretty game. It's in here it is in its EGA 16 color glory. The sound is pretty awful, but the graphics hold up considering the time in which this game was made. This game's pretty cutting edge, and so given the fact that it's 25 years later, it holds up fairly well. But, if you want to skip ahead and actually, watch the bombs drop, feel free to hit the next video. But if you want to learn how to play the game a little bit, I'll show you what we're gonna do, what all the buttons do here in this one right here. And so, with that being said, this game as an operational level game, you only have so many scenarios that you can play. The major carrier battles of World War II. And starting with Pearl Harbor, which is the one I want to start with today. But like I said, it's not a strategic level game, so you don't really get to get outside of any of these and create your own battles. But each one of these kind of does put you into the point of view of an admiral during that time, and that's pretty cool as far as I'm concerned because there's not so much that you can control and there's not so much that you can do, but when you actually do pull something off that's really cool, it feels that much better. And if you don't pull it off, you could blame it on the computer, and that's just fine. So anyway, let's start with the Pearl Harbor scenario here to kind of show you around the game a little bit. Right off the bat, I want you to notice that this is Pearl Harbor. And so with our excessive use of vowels here, we can tell that this game is not an American-made game. No, it actually comes from a couple fellers in Australia, and they've done a pretty bang-up job on this game. But anyway, when you're ready to pick a scenario, just go ahead and click it, and then you can pick the various commanders that you want to play as. Now, you can hot seat this game and play as both Chuichi Nagumo and General Short, Admiral Kimmel, Admiral Halsey, and Admiral Fletcher, but I don't play as the Japanese, so we're going to be playing against a computer here. Now, these are broken up into different types of commands, and so the folks up here are always going to be your land-based air bases and things like that, and the folks down here are going to be in command of various task forces. And you can pick and choose whichever ones you want. For this sake, I'll just go ahead and pick, let's see, we'll do General Walter Short, who's the Army commander in Oahu at this time, Admiral Kimmel, who was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Halsey, who had a carrier task force, and Frank Jack Fletcher, who had another carrier task force. We'll go ahead and click off him just so we can show you around the carriers a little bit, and we'll let the computer play as Frank Jack Fletcher and Admiral Nagumo. Now, the other thing you can do in here, and this is true of all the scenarios, is click this button here, which is War Room Selection, and this basically gives you different scenarios for each individual campaign or each individual battle that you're going to fight. Now, I like to fight, I like to do the historical stuff and test my mettle against history in some ways, but if you want to do something a little bit different, that's fine by me. But we're going to stick with the historical one here. So let's just go ahead and start a new game. Now, like I said, this is an Australian-made game, and if you notice, there's a couple Australian addresses on there. The other guy I want to give a shout-out to is Ian Trout, your game designer. Now, unfortunately, he passed away a couple years ago, but he's an interesting guy as far as game design goes because he actually owned a historical military history bookstore in Australia. And you can see a lot of his touches in this game, as well as the actual manual itself, which this is an original version of the game, so I do have the manual. He's got an entire history of the Pacific War written in the back of it. You don't see that in too many manuals anymore. But beyond that, he's got a lot of historical touches in this game that make this game really deep as far as history or as far as war games go. I mean, some of the modern ones do a pretty good job of that too, but this one's just got enough nuance and enough detail in it to really make you appreciate that, the folks who designed this really cared about what they were trying to do. But anyway, let's move on here. This is the actual map that you're going to spend a lot of time on. And we can notice that we got Hawaii down here and then Midway all the way up here. These American flags denote air bases, and these individual little white dots here represent individual task forces out there. If there are any Japanese ones that we could see right off the bat, they'd show up as red. And if there were any Japanese air bases, they'd show that little meatball flag that they got. But right now, it's the peacetime Army and Navy, and this is Hawaii. It's all American, and everything's cool. And, it's Saturday night, December 6, 1941. Everybody's out, on the town, getting a little drunk. And, all those who aren't getting drunk, getting ready for church, going to bed in the morning. And this scenario, hats off to the designers for actually including Pearl Harbor in this one, because this isn't really a battle. It's more of a bushwhacking. And you're kind of stuck on rails here as the Americans, because anything we tell everybody to do, not really going to take it too seriously, because it's still, hey man, it's the peacetime Army and Navy. So Japan's 2,000 miles away across the Pacific Ocean. We don't care about that. Well, little do we know, but, you and I know, but the folks in the scenario, not so much, that the Japanese have about 6 aircraft carriers hovering right around here, and they've got a little surprise plan for us in the morning. And like I said, this one, we're kind of on rails here, because whatever we tell our guys to do, they're not really going to do it. But anyway, to show you around the game a little bit, this is pretty straightforward. If you play a hot seat game, which you can do in this original version, is pretty cool if you have a good buddy who wants to do this with you. But right now the Japanese are grayed out, so we can't really do much with them. The Americans up here, of course, those are our guys, so let's go ahead and take a look at them. And here we have each of our individual commanders with General Martin Short, or I'm sorry, Walter Short. Martin Short's a completely different guy up here. Admiral Kimmel and Admiral Halsey. Of course, we didn't pick Mr. Frank Jack Fletcher, so we can't click on his stuff. But the computer will control his task force. But General Short here has several air bases. Admiral Kimmel's got several fleets, and Halsey's got a single carrier task group. Let's go through each one of those in a little bit more detail to kind of show you around the game a bit. So your air bases here, when you click on your air commander, are represented by these green squares. Notice we got a gray one right here. That gray one, what is that? That's Hilo over here. It's still an airstrip, but we don't have any planes there, so there's not much we can do with it. Let's go take a look at this first one here, which is Hickam. Hickam's a great big Air Force, Army Air Force base in World War II, or in Hawaii during World War II. It predates the Air Force, and we've got a lot of planes here, and we can tell that by taking a look at this. This bar right here tells us what kind of weather it's got. It looks pretty good. And then this right here tells us what kind of runway it is. It's a big runway, no damage. Base squadron number, it tells us right there that we got 6 squadrons here that are ready. And 96 planes on the aircraft spot. That means this air base is pretty big. It can spot 96 aircraft at any given point in time. Down here, it'll show us if there's any kind of enemy planes coming in. Of course, this is 1941, and we don't really have that much radar capacity. So that's basically dependent upon, oh my God, there's planes right over us right now. And so it will tell us that in this panel right here, if they happen to show up, which I'm pretty sure they will in the morning. Now down here, the only thing we can do with Hickam right now is actually send out search planes, and you get this radio dial that gives you different compass headings. You can send out as many search planes as you want, but the computer will kind of decide how many to put in each sector. Now, again, this is the peacetime army, so they're not going to send very many out in each sector. Later on in the war, they'll send out quite a few more. This number right here tells us how many are ready and how many are actually up right now. And the answer to that question is 0. Because again, it's the peacetime army. We have no idea what's about to happen in the morning. We can go ahead and click off Southwest here because we got a couple task forces out here. They'll be able to spot anything that Hickam doesn't. But that's on the action screen button right here. Each airbase has 3 different buttons right here. Action screen 1 always comes up in first, and you can do some pretty basic stuff right there. The next one's kind of interesting. This is the information button. And this shows you all the squadrons that are actually in this airbase. Right now they're all dispersed, which means that each one of these squadrons is parked somewhere on the base. You know, a little bit of history right here. At this point in time, General Walter Short thought that the local Japanese population was a real threat, and he parked all of his planes in the middle of the runway. That's not going to work out tomorrow. But being dispersed, these planes are basically parked and fueled down, and, you know, there's not much going on with them. We can tell what kind of planes they are. These ones right here are all bombers because they have this top-down view of the plane. And these here are patrol planes or search planes, and we can tell that just because they kind of look like the old Catalina PBYs. And each one of these, it represents a single type of aircraft in that squadron. So this one right here is the B-18 Bolo, which is essentially a 1930s version of the 737. We're not really going to do much damage with these tomorrow, if any of them survive. But, you know, it's kind of neat historical detail that we're going to blow up all these planes tomorrow and we'll never see them again. But anyway, right here it shows what kind of plane it is, the actual squadron number, and these are all historical. And then how many planes we got? We got 17. All of them are okay, and all of them are dispersed right now. Let's see what else we got here. We got A-20 Havocs. They're not bad, more so a ground attack plane than an anti-Navy plane. And then we got some B-17s. We only got 5 of them, though. B-17s, great planes later on in the game, but they don't really do that much damage against ships. And considering we don't have any Japanese air bases on Hawaii that we're going to bomb, these are going to be pretty useless tomorrow. These other planes, I think they're all PBYs. Yeah, they're all PBYs. Great plane. Survived the entire war. And, you know, great range on them. Very much so a search plane, but in a pinch, you can also use them as a torpedo bomber. We got quite a few of those here at Hickam. Okay, cool. But Hickam doesn't really have that much other than strike aircraft. If we actually had a target, we could hit the strike button, and it would show up different targets here that we could select and actually send a bombing mission against them. But, you know, we'll see how the morning turns out. But right now, we don't have anything to strike, and everybody's on the town having a good time, so we're not really going to bother any of these guys. Next airbase here is Wheeler, and Wheeler is full of fighters. If you take a look at these, when you have this profile view of a plane, that's a fighter squadron. These look like they're P-39 Airacobras, even though it says Warhawk for some reason. And we got quite a few of these here. So these buttons down here will actually give you different options to do with each aircraft squadron. So now fighters can fly CAP, which stands for Combat Air Patrol, and you can put as many of these up as you want. And we're going to go ahead and throw all of them up here this morning, just in case. We'll be the Cassandra of this operation and say, oh my God, the Japanese are going to be all over us in the morning. Unfortunately, nobody's going to believe us. And so, like I said, this is the peacetime army. I can put as many of these up as I want, but they're not really going to take me seriously until bombs start dropping in the morning. But this will give us a leg up on them. I don't know, what are these are P-36 Mohawks. These are beautiful planes, but very, very outdated. I'm sure they'll do just fine against Mr. Zero in the morning. Let's try and send everybody up and see how that goes. So anyway, Wheeler here, that's one of the things you can do with CAP because they have a lot of fighter planes here. The other things you can do is you can give individual squadrons orders. Usually in this point in time, all you can do is arm and fuel them. And that would have them ready on deck in the morning. We could click this button, but it's not really going to matter. They're not going to do it here at 9 o'clock at night on December 6, 1941. Because, you know, the Japanese are all the way on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. We don't have to worry about that, man. So But, once the war gets kicked off, this might be a good thing to do in the middle of the night. So just so your planes are ready in the morning. The other thing you can do here is transfer planes, and you can transfer them to different air bases within the area. And that includes carrier-based planes. You can transfer carrier-based planes to land bases, but you can never transfer a land-based squadron over to a carrier. Or you can't transfer squadrons between carriers either. But there are times where you want to do this. But again, here in 1941, tomorrow is going to be a bad day for us. And the real trick is to try to get us set up to the point in time where it's not a terrible day. Let's see, these are P-40s. Those are really good planes. We'll go ahead and put all those up. See if they actually attack Wheeler tomorrow. Or Bellows, sorry. Aweigh, we got more P-39s. Let's go ahead and throw those up in the morning as well. What else we got here? More Mohawks. Yeah, we'll go ahead and send 6 pilots to their deaths. Why not? And then out here at Midway, all we got is PBYs. If we go back to the action screen, this is Midway way out here. You notice up here that, Midway's having kind of a rough night, but that's okay. And what else we got? We got Aweigh, which is the Marine Air Base there. Oh, we got some Wildcats here. These are good planes. Not quite up to snuff against Mr. Zero, but they're pretty, oh wow, we got some bombers here too. Vindicators, those are very, very old dive bombers. And then Dauntlesses, all right, we got 22 of them. That's pretty good. So maybe tomorrow we'll be able to hit them back a little bit, but we'll see how it goes. So anyway, that's about all you can do with the air bases out there. Each one of those air bases can actually make a big difference later in the game just because it's an unsinkable aircraft carrier, but not typically. So actually, Aweigh can throw up some search planes here. Let's go ahead and do that because they had Dauntlesses. What did they have? They had Vindicators. Yeah, we might as well send the Vindicators out because if we send those against Kido Butai, which is the Japanese task force that's right about here somewhere, they're pretty much going to die. So we'll leave them be. So that's about all you can do with the air bases. We don't have a target to strike, otherwise I'd show you how to do that. But we do have several task forces here. So the first one is Admiral Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. So husband Kimmel, the guy who's going to lose his job here in about 3 days because he managed to keep most of the fleet in the harbor. And that was, at the time he was criticized for that decision, but over time, historians kind of vindicated him because he was pretty clever in terms of sending all his carriers out. These are all the carrier task groups here, and not having those in port. And if he had any carriers in port, we would have lost those for sure. So he kept all the battleships in the harbor, and they're about to wind up on the bottom of the harbor. But you have to understand at the time, this was the pride of the American Navy. Is the successor of Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, and a lot of money and a lot of effort and a lot of pride went into all these ships, and they're about to wind up at the bottom of the harbor in the morning. So anyway, when you click on a task force, you get these 4 buttons right here. The first one is just the action button. It's very similar to the air bases with the same things. It tells you the status of it. In this case, this task force is in port. It's at anchor, not moving at all, and it's capable of 21 knots, and that's thanks to our old battleships. I don't think any of these ships have radar, but if we saw some planes show up here, they'd show up there. And if we had any search planes on these ships, we could actually send them out as well. Now, later in the war, most of the task groups, as long as they contain a cruiser in them, will be able to do this to a certain extent. But your carrier task forces are much, much more effective because most of your cruisers will only have a handful of planes. Now, that's the action screen. The next one is the movement screen here, or the button here. And we could actually tell these guys to get out of here and say, hey, get out of port and pour on some speed. But to tell you the truth, they're not really going to do that, so we might as well just leave them in port right now. I've been picking on the peacetime Army, but the peacetime Navy wasn't much better. They're just, it's the peace, man. I mean, everybody's cool. We don't have to worry about anything. It's Sunday, man. Don't send us out of the harbor on Sunday. So, like I said, this scenario is a little difficult to play as the Americans. The only hope you really have is that they don't blow up everything. And they might very well do that. So we'll just leave him in port here, and that's okay. So notice that Admiral Kimmel has several of these green buttons here. And that means that he has several task groups under his command. Now, if you have two task groups like this, you can order one of these secondary ones to back up the main one. This is the flag group right here, and noted by this little gray slash right there. And we could tell him, instead of heading somewhere, we could tell him to just stick with them. We can tell them to forward cover, which means that they steam about 40 miles ahead of the main task group. Escort them, which means that they're basically going to bunch up with them. Or support them, which means that they're going to steam basically 40 miles behind them. But right now, all of these groups are basically stuck in port. And, you know, in the interest of historical accuracy, we'll just leave them there and see how bad it gets tomorrow. But anyway, so that's the movement screen on this, and you could also order them to port facilities or to rendezvous with another TG out there, but that's okay. We won't do any of those things. The other thing, this is the surface screen. This game does contain a surface combat element, and I think, like I said at the beginning of the video, there's not very many situations. I mean, there's not a tactical element to this game except for this. And you don't steer individual ships, and you don't necessarily tell who to fire on which particular ship. It's certainly not a gunnery exercise, but there are ways to actually do some pretty intense surface combat here. I'll wait to a future video to actually show you that when it actually matters, because right now the Japanese aren't going to steam into Pearl Harbor and blow us up. They're pretty much going to bomb the crap out of us, so we'll just let them do it. And the last screen, which is really the interesting one here, let me get my mug off here to show you this, is the status screen. And the status screen shows you each of the individual ships in the entire task group. This one's just battleships and a whole ton of destroyers. And each one of these is, you know, accompanied by a graphic, and some of them are pretty historically accurate. Of the ship, and then if you click on this right here, it'll show you the stats for each ship, which is pretty interesting as well. Now, it'll have different ratings for all the different various aspects of the ship. So armor, we got 14 inches here. Battery, we got an 18-inch, and this isn't necessarily in inches, even though it says inches right here. This is more of a rating. You know, and so this ship had multiple turrets, you know, with I think 16-inch guns, if I'm not mistaken, on the Nevada, and so it's bumped up a little bit just because it's representative of more batteries than was normal. Same thing with secondary turrets, and then you know, the secondary anti-naval guns, and then it's got these two ratings for AA guns, so heavy AA and light AA. Heavy AA is at 3, light AA. This dash means 0. And again, this is early in the war, so nobody really thought that anti-aircraft was going to be as important as it turned out to be, but that's okay. Those come up later. Over here, we got the max speed of the ship, and then vulnerability is on a scale of 0 to 7, with 7 being the best and 0 being the worst. Vulnerability is just basically how survivable the ship is and how, you know, easily it's going to be able to avoid damage. Damage control, notice that the Nevada here has 0, and that's because this is the pre-war Navy, and we haven't had much practice at actually trying to keep a ship afloat, because we haven't had any combat practice in, I don't know, since the war of the Spanish-American War, so to speak, and so we're not too good at this, and that's going to be a problem tomorrow. Fire control is how well the ship can actually shoot other things, planes and ships. And notice this one is at 0 as well. And finally, down here we have our radar range, and obviously we have 0 miles on both of these, which means that our ship has no radar. And so I guess they'll be able to, you know, figure out they're getting attacked as soon as the Japanese drop a few bombs on them. But anyway, each one of these ships has its own graphic. And notice right now, even though the ship's not moving, it's got a bow wave, and that's just because the game doesn't have a animation for stopped or dead calm. But I assure you, all of these ships are absolutely parked in the harbor right now. So we'll take a look at a few of them here. Got the Tennessee, California, let's see, West Virginia, there we go. A little bit more modern right there. Maryland, yeah. So this is the famous battleship row in Pearl Harbor. Here's the USS Arizona. And, you know, we'll see how bad we get beat up tomorrow. But with that being said, that's about all we can do with this task group right here. So we'll go ahead and kill that. And let's take a look at the weather. So right now, this shows us all the weather patterns, and this will be really, really important later in the game. Right now, we know that Kido Butai is up around here somewhere. They're not really hiding from us, but then again, we're not really looking for them, so we don't have to worry about that. So let's go ahead and clear that off. And our last task group here is Admiral Halsey, and he has got the USS Lexington up here, and he's heading out here. Whenever you're moving a ship or a task group, it'll show up with a little red dot towards his destination. And he's moving at 15 knots. He can make 33 knots. No search planes out. Let's go ahead and send a few search planes out in the morning just to see what we can find. And with his task group, it's got the exact same things, even though it's listed as a carrier right here. So notice that the carrier's in the back on the surface screen. Here's our status page with the USS Lexington right there, and a couple heavy cruisers. No problem, no worries, but we'll just let Admiral Halsey move on out of here. In fact, you know what? We don't want Kido Butai to find these guys, so we'll pour on a little bit of gas right there, shall we? All right, the only other thing that's different is notice that Admiral Kimmel here doesn't have any carriers, so this box is grayed out. Admiral Halsey's got the Lexington, and so he's got a carrier box right here. You click on that. This is exactly the same as the air bases, with the exception of, right now it'll show you what kind of ships are in the task group down here, as opposed towards the individual planes. But if you click on this right here, the information screen, it's exactly like the air bases, same screen, and these each indicate a different. Oh my God, these are Brewster Buffaloes. These planes are death traps. We will not be using those in the morning, hopefully. But we got some Dauntlesses on here and some Devastator torpedo planes. Notice that we got one squadron of fighters, 3 squadrons of bombers on here. And we can do the same thing that we do with the air bases. Go ahead and throw some of these guys up on cap here. Let's go ahead and use about half of them, just in case Kido Butai decides to come down here and pay us a little visit. Yeah, see, we could transfer these planes, to the air bases, but let's just leave them on the carrier, shall we? Finally, the last thing that I want to point out is this button down here, which is our briefing screen, which will give you information on all the squadrons for your side and all the different ships for your side. If you want to look them up, you can go ahead and click on these each year. It'll show you the data on each one if you click this button out there. And so the game's got quite a bit of detail in it. I really want to point out here the fighter squadrons. These are all historical squadrons that actually existed at that time. But if you go in there, it'll show you each individual plane in the entire squadron and basically its own status. And that's because this game is pretty complex when you get down to it. So individual planes will fight individual planes. When they attack ships, they'll do so as individual planes, not as entire squadrons. And at the end of the entire thing, you'll be able to see the results of each individual plane, each individual ship, and it gets pretty intense, but it's also pretty deep as far as the game goes. And so with that being said, let's go ahead and X out all of this right here and get back here, and I'll explain to you a little bit about how the game works. Now that we've issued a few orders, just some cap in the morning, again, we could do it tonight, but they're not going to do anything about it. What happens at this point in time is you decide to run the game. And this game operates off a synchronous turn. And so with the synchronous turn, you issue the orders, the computer issues their orders, and they both run at the same time. And the way that you run the game is with this control panel right here. You can just run it indefinitely for an hour or 5 minutes till the next hour, dusk, dawn. And it'll constantly update what you decided to do and what they decided to do. And it'll all happen in the same time. Now, it'll stop running if you hit this play button here and decide to break it at certain times. So we can break it whenever combat occurs. And now if any shooting starts, it'll stop. So we can, click back into here and check stuff. Or you can set that so that it just goes. And if you take that off and just run it, it'll run it regardless. And as far as the combat goes, it gets pretty intense. And so, with the next video here, we'll actually drop some bombs on Pearl Harbor. But at the end of this video here, let's just talk about the scenario a little bit. Pearl Harbor was really a bad time for the Americans because they were absolutely surprised. And I mean, unless you read some of that alternative history out there, which really doesn't count, if you're serious about this war, this really was a surprise attack. And as far as the Japanese went, they thought that it was necessary at the time to wipe out the American fleet as quickly as possible so they could maintain their empire. But as far as the Americans went, they had no idea that Japan was actually going to show up here. Sure, there were some intercepts and some messages that actually pointed in that direction, but most of them were actually stopped at mid-level in terms of the intelligence agencies at the time because it was just kind of like Chicken Little stuff. And, the sky wasn't necessarily falling. And so at this point in time, December 6, 1941, everybody's cool. Now that's going to change in about 10 hours here. But at the same point in time, you have to understand that, I mean, a lot of you weren't, old enough to appreciate what was going on at, say, like 9/11. But for those of us who were at the bar when that happened, it was pretty shocking. And this was a kickoff to a really bloody war that involved a lot of pain, a lot of heartache, and both countries turned out to be very, very different places by 1945. And this is the kickoff to all of that. And so, again, this almost occurred about 75 years ago. It seems almost like a distant memory now, but what's going to happen here in about 10 hours is going to change the course of history. So I hope to see you there.